Again, thanks for having me talk to your group. I always like teaching. It's something that was actually a big part of my day job. So giving talks on woodworking, I look as an opportunity to teach and share. And so today I'm going to talk about Japanese chisels for the Western woodworker. So just by way of introduction, my name's Wilbur Pan. I have been woodworking for probably about a dozen years at this point. But back in 2010, I started this blog because woodworking blogs were the thing back then. It's called Giant Cypress. It's primarily about things that I've been figuring out about Japanese tools, and then it sort of took off, it took a life of its own. But the website is there in case you have some time that you need to waste and take a look at things. But I do have some write-ups on how to use Japanese tools there, along with a lot of other stuff. So my day job, again, I give a lot of talks as well, and one of the things I was trained to do is to give you do all the disclaimers and conflicts of interest before starting the talk. So I'm kind of in the habit of doing that. So first of all, number one, I have not been trained by some master Japanese carpenter or woodworker. I'm a hobbyist woodworker, like I'm guessing most of you guys are. The second thing is that I'm not Japanese. My family's from China. My parents are from China originally. And I don't speak Japanese. And the last time I was in Japan was like in the mid-70s, where we stopped over on the way from Chicago, where I grew up, on the way to Taiwan. And the only thing I remember is being extremely jet lagged because I was in grade school at the time, and my parents waking me up to go down to eat dinner, and I looked at the menu and I ordered rainbow trout because it was the only thing that I recognized. So my entire impression of Japan is a very sleepy dinner eating rainbow trout that was actually very good. So that's that. But a lot of this stuff I've kind of figured out along the way in terms of being interested in Japanese tools and how they work. But like I said, I just want to make sure you guys know who's giving you this information. The other thing that I like to point out is that oftentimes when I'm asked to give a talk on Japanese tools, I'm sort of expected to cover like the whole gamut of everything. And I don't know if you all know this, but Woody Allen actually used to be a stand-up comedian before he became a movie director and started marrying his children. So there's an actual album called Woody Allen Stand-Up Comic, and one of the bits that he does is he talks about a speed reading course that he took, and he was able to read War and Peace in 2 hours. And then he says, it's about Russia. So that's one thing I try to keep in mind, that I don't want to go through things so quickly that you just sort of come away with the notion about Japanese chisels being interesting, and maybe that's it. I really want to try to explain how these things work for you all. So please feel free to ask questions along the way, so that we can, because I want you guys to come away from this with something useful for you all. Okay. This is a Bible box that I built, and again, like I said, I'm a hobbyist woodworker, and I actually built this as a part of a group build project that our club ran. And it's a pretty nice, Bible box. I think it's basically made out of walnut, and the main part of the case is dovetailed, and you can see molding applied at the bottom and a molding on the lid at the top. We use snipe hinges to attach the lid to the case, so the top lid just lifts open, and then we installed the little a lock on it, and then you can see that the front is veneered with walnut burl, and then a walnut banding veneer around the perimeter, and then the legs are turned, and those are all the elements of a Bible box. It's a household wooden thing that was pretty common in the Philadelphia area back in the late 1700s. And it was called a Bible box because that's what you would stick in it. It was big enough to put the family Bible in. I'm not sure of the utility of the lock because it can hold a Bible, but if someone broke into your house, they could just pick the thing up and walk off with it, and then later take a saw to it and get to the inside if they really wanted to. But that's it. But the reason I'm showing this to you is I just wanted you to keep this in mind. You know, this is a pretty traditional American piece of woodworking history, because I'm going to come back to this at the end of the talk. All right, so you may recognize this dude. His name's Chuck Bender. He used to be one of the editors at Popular Woodworking, and he has taught woodworking for a long time. He's a fantastic period furniture maker. And this is the sort of guy that most people think about when you hear woodworker. You know, he's got machinery as represented by the bandsaw that's in the back, and he's got a big load of machinery. But when he's teaching, he's usually teaching smaller scale processes like dovetail joints and things like that. So he's got a workbench and hand tools in front of him. Most importantly, he's got facial hair, so that's a real key. But like I said, this is what most people think of in the US and the Western world when we think woodworking. And then when the subject of Japanese woodworking comes up, this is the image that often comes to mind. You've got some guy sitting down on the floor, like using his body as a clamp, and these weird tools that are cutting on the pull stroke instead of the push stroke, and that's what I found most people think about when I mention Japanese woodworking tools. And then the conversation quickly switches over to the Zen of woodworking, which never ever comes up in Western woodworking. And that's interesting to me because I've actually found that Japanese woodworkers that I've met along the way, and woodworkers in Asia in general, actually have the same priorities that those of us here in the US and the Western world have. Because basically what they want to do is they have sharp pieces of metal, the tools, that they use to shape pieces of wood so they can build stuff. And I can promise you that over in Asia, the priority there is to get the thing done. And as cheaply as possible, which is pretty much what we were talking about earlier, that most woodworkers in the US are. This person in particular, his name's Inamoto, and excuse me, he's famous for making the wooden bodies of Japanese planes. And he can crank these things out like nobody's business. He's also been doing it for a very, very long time. So he's very skilled at his job. But again, when he's making these, chopping out the throat for Japanese planes and fitting it to the blade, he wants to get the thing done so he can move on to the next plane, so he can finish however many planes that he wants to build that day, so he can get home and have dinner. So even though there are a lot of obvious differences when you see this guy compared to Chuck Bender, I actually think there's more in common than what we might think. And in terms of why this why we have this issue, I blame this guy. So his name is Edward. Oh, hang on a second. Oops. I think his name is Edward Basher. But basically, if you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York, and you go to the back end of the first floor, what you'll see is a whole lot of suits of armor, and then in the corner there's going to be a lot of samurai armor and samurai swords and things like that. And this dude is the one that brought all this stuff back from Japan in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And his family was rich, and so they donated a whole bunch of it, and that's why you see his name on the wall in that part of the museum. But this is a picture of him dressed up in samurai gear. And my first impression of this picture is like a big disconnect, because this guy is clearly not a samurai warrior, but he's dressing the part. And it's this sort of disconnect, I think, just because people in the US and the Western world are just not as familiar with Asian culture and Japanese culture in particular that they could be. I think that's starts setting up barriers to people in terms of thinking about Japanese woodworking tools, even though I think they're fantastic tools, and hopefully by the end of the talk today you will too. So basically that's where I come from in terms of thinking about Japanese woodworking tools. And where I landed on this is that my shop is not that big. I'll pan around when I'm back on video later, but it's only 10 by 20 feet, and it's right underneath the kitchen and dining area in my house. And I have HVAC stuff going across the ceiling straight up. And so when I was starting to get into woodworking, I knew too much about what dust could do to a kid's lungs. And I wanted to try to avoid the dust issue as possible. And I also didn't have a whole lot of space for a lot of machinery. So I started getting into the idea of trying to do as much with hand tools as possible. It's not that I don't have machinery. I have a bandsaw and a small jointer planer combo machine and a couple drill presses. But I do try to do things with hand tools just because of the dust issue. And then when I started learning about hand tools, being Chinese, I learned about these Japanese hand tools and how people would speak of them as having like these fantastic properties. And being Asian, I think that's where I latched onto this. But then I wanted to find out why these things work. And the story that I always hear is, you have a chisel that's made by this guy who's like 80 years old, and he's been doing this all of his life, and his kids don't want to take up blacksmithing. So after he dies, these chisels aren't going to be made anymore. So buy them before he passes away. And I would say, okay, fine, but why should I buy this particular chisel? And then the answer would be, but the guy is 80 years old, which didn't sit well with me because I like to get straightforward answers to my questions. So in order to understand Japanese tools, it's always good to understand history, because anytime you're talking about woodworking from processes that have been used a long time, here in the 21st century, we often don't know what was going on in society at the time that these tools were really being used. And I think the issue with the Japanese tools is no exception. So as I mentioned before, I'm of Chinese descent. And so basically, I'll be chauvinistic and start with China and the Ming Dynasty. So the Ming Dynasty took place between the mid-1300s to the mid-1600s. And it's a pretty settled point that this was actually the center of all culture and commerce and art and economic and literature and everything in the Asian world. China was really just that dominant during that period of time. Now, what was going on in Japan towards the end of the Ming Dynasty is that's when the Sakoku period came into play. And basically what happened was that the Japanese emperor decreed that for whatever reason, Japan should be Japan and not deal with the outside world. And by not dealing with the outside world, I don't mean, we're going to avoid those, European people over there. They didn't even want to deal with other Asian countries. So basically, if you were from another country, you could not visit Japan with very rare exceptions. And if you're Japanese, you never left the country except for very rare exceptions as well. And this period of time in Japanese history continued into the mid-1800s when Admiral Perry shows up in the bay of what is now Tokyo with a bunch of warships and said, hey, open up your country because we want to do business with you and make money. And we have cannons. So, that's when that period ended. This also happens to be the period that what we think of as in terms of period furniture here in the Western woodworking world takes place. So if you think about it, during the period of isolation, we have the Jacobean period, and then the William and Mary period, and then the Queen Anne period, and then the Federal Sheraton period, and the Chippendale Hepplewhites, and the Shaker period. And all of this is happening while Japan is cut off from the outside world. So it's probably not, too hard of an idea to conceive that if all of this development has been occurring in the outside woodworking world and you've been cut off from that, then the methods by which you work wood may veer off in a different direction. I sometimes think about Japanese woodworking tools as like the platypus of woodworking tools, where it was just isolated for such a long period of time that they really wound up developing their own methods of doing things. So let's talk about chisels. And stop sharing and go to my live camera. Oops. Okay, can everybody see me? All right. So this is a pretty typical Japanese chisel. I actually picked this one off of eBay, and it was really rusty, and I restored it, and it turned out to be. Where's the camera? There it is. It turned out to work pretty good. You know, there's nothing special about this chisel, but it has all the typical characteristics of a Japanese chisel. So starting from the back end, you have this hoop here, and then a wooden handle, and then a ferrule into which the main shaft of the tool end of the chisel is inserted. And then you have the blade of the chisel. And one of the things that you'll notice is that, hopefully this shows up on the camera, is that there's a lamination line across the bevel of the chisel here. And what you should be able to see, I hope, is that the top part of the chisel is sort of like this darker gray metal, and then the bottom part is this more shiny metal. Can you all see that? I just want to make sure this is coming across. Yes? Okay. A little bit. Okay, great. Okay, so in terms of how this chisel is put together, if any of you are, you know, hand tool fanatics, you know that people usually talk about chisels in the Western world as either having a tang or a socket. And what I have here is another chisel that I just basically took apart and used for, you know, talk purposes. But what you can see is that on the main body of the chisel, there is a tang there. It's kind of a short, stubby, squarish profile tang. But there's also a ferrule that, like I said, that fits over that. And on the handle side, what you'll see is that there's a shaping of the handle so that it can fit into a socket, but also a hole in there that's sized to fit the tang. So basically what you get here is the best of both worlds. The tang makes a very secure connection of the chisel to the handle, but the ferrule here makes this connection very strong because because this will also prevent the chisel handle from splitting as you use it. So I thought this is actually pretty clever, you know, construction. And then finally, the other aspect of the Japanese chisel is that on the back side, there's a hollow that I hope you can see as I rotate the chisel back and forth. Now there's a little flat part over here that's polished up when you're sharpening, but the hollow takes up the majority of the back of the chisel, so that the only thing that's in plane with the front part is like a little rim of steel that goes all the way around like that. And the reason for that is that the layer of steel that's here at the cutting edge, the more shiny part of the Japanese chisel, is actually quite a bit harder than what we would find in a chisel in the Western world. Rockwell hardness, if you guys know that, is typically around 63 to 65 for this, whereas Western chisels tend to have Rockwell hardness around 60, 61, 62 or so. And so if you think about it, if this is all very hard steel, and as we all know, if you're starting to use a chisel, one of the first things you want to do is flatten the back, and especially get the area right behind the cutting edge very flat. If all of this is hard steel, that would be a real pain in the butt to do. So by deliberately putting a hollow into this area, you only have to flatten this perimeter and then this area that's immediately behind the cutting edge, which I think is like a pretty clever thing, but it's actually not unique to Japan, and I'll get to that in a little bit. There are a lot of other types of Japanese chisels as well. So this is just another example of the same type of chisel I was holding up before. It's a bench chisel, and this is the type of chisel that I basically reach for like 80–90% of the time when I'm using one. There is a Japanese version of a Mortise chisel. So this chisel is only about 1/4 inch wide, but you can tell here that top to bottom it's much thicker, and the bevel is put at about 35 degrees as opposed to the 30 degrees that the bench chisels are typically coming at. You know, these bevel angles are actually pretty remarkably similar to what happens in the Western world, because if you buy a Mortise chisel from, say, Tools for Working Wood, it'll also be at about a 35 degree bevel. But if you look at the bevel here from the front, hopefully you can see the lamination line, so that's still there. And on the bottom, there's still a hollow that's placed into the bottom of the chisel. This is what's called a timber framing chisel, and you can see that it's basically, I mean, this is a wider chisel, but that's not what makes it a timber framing chisel, because there are bench chisels that come this wide as well. But what you can see is that this one is longer, and just everything about it seems to be heftier compared to the bench chisel. The handle is thicker, the shaft here is thicker, and this is really meant for timber framing processes. This is the Japanese version of a paring chisel. This one's meant to be used only by pushing, and so that's why there's no hoop on the back, because the hoop is to help out with the handle staying intact if you're using a hammer to chop wood with. These are really nice to use, and I have this set up with actually a shallower bevel angle because I know that I'm only going to be using this for paring, and so the lower angle actually does help with that. It also has the same lamination that you can see in the front and the same hollow that you see on the back side. The profile here, however, is triangular in nature, as opposed to the profile of this chisel, which sort of comes up at an angle and then is flat at the top. This is sometimes referred to as a dovetail profile, but it's really not a dovetail, a thing that you could necessarily use for just, you know, getting into the corner of a dovetail, because it actually comes up a little bit before this angle takes up. But that's the name that people describe this as, and that's the name that sort of stuck. There's actually no functional purpose to this triangular profile. It just looks nice, and that's really why I got these particular paring chisels. This is an interesting chisel. It's called a gooseneck chisel, and you can use this to pare out the bottom of a groove or a sliding dovetail, the female part of a sliding dovetail, because you can just like place it flat in the groove and push it along, and it'll level out any hills in the bottom of your groove. And I do, and that's actually what I use this for, is cleaning up the bottom of a groove or the female part of a sliding dovetail, much like you might use a router plane to do. And it's really nice for that purpose. These three chisels are a little bit specialized. They're used for dealing with small mortises. This isn't really a chisel, it's really more like a knife blade on a stick. But the curve profile allows you to really get into the corner of the bottom of the mortise and get rid of any stray pieces of wood that might be blocking that up. This thing also is not exactly a chisel. The tip of this is not very sharp at all. As you can see, I'm not drawing any blood with this, but what you can use this for is cleaning out the wood chips as you chop out a chisel, or running it along the bottom to help level off the bottom of the chisel. And this is called a harpoon chisel because it looks like a harpoon, and people use this also to help get into the corner of the ends of the mortise. The idea being that you drive the chisel in, and then this little ledge here helps scoop out waste as you pull it out. This chisel has a round profile, and it's very much like an in-canal gouge that you might see in the Western world. You still have the lamination here that I'm hoping you all can see. But the backside does not have the hollow, obviously, because it's convex in nature. And I have a set of these in varying widths, and it's good for, you know, getting into a curved outline when I need to when I'm using a project that involves curves. And then what I have here is actually a whole set of Japanese carving chisels. There are a bunch of out canal gouges of different widths and curvatures, just like you would find. There are some skew chisels here. This is a little gouge that's on an angle, so you can like scoop and get around your work that way. And there's a V gouge here. And there's a couple others besides, but basically what I wanted to just show is that when it comes to Japanese chisels, there's a huge variety of chisels that can be used for many different purposes, just like there are a lot of different Western style chisels that are out there that you can buy for whatever purpose that you want. I think the main differences, however, between Japanese chisels and Western chisels is really a matter of scale. So this is, again, one of the bench chisels that I have. And this is a Marples chisel that I picked up from the big box store. And what you can see is that if you put them side by side, the Japanese chisel has a shorter handle and a shorter blade, relatively speaking, than the bench chisel does. The same is also true for my Japanese Mortise chisel. Here I have my Japanese Mortise chisel, and here I have a pig sticker that I picked up from Tools for Working Wood. And you can see, if I put them side by side, that the blade of the Mortise chisel is shorter than the blade of the Western Mortise chisel, and that the handles are likewise shorter as well. And I don't have a Western paring chisel myself, but I've seen them, and the same is true for the Japanese paring chisels compared to the Western paring chisels, that the Japanese paring chisels tend to be a little bit shorter in scale. Now, whether or not you like that, I think just depends on the person. I know people who have been using Western chisels for a very long time, and they like the length that they're used to, and they find the Japanese chisels too small for what to feel comfortable with what they did. But but my experience has been that for most people that are relatively new to woodworking, or those who don't do a whole lot of hand tool work, that the smaller scale of the Japanese chisel actually makes it easier to maneuver and manipulate. And that's actually one of the things that I find really nice about the Japanese chisels, is that I actually prefer the chisel to be relatively shorter. And that's one of the advantages that I see to these guys. Any questions so far? No? Okay.
Is there much of a difference between sharpening techniques
no.
in either case?
No. And actually I can move on to that. That's one of the things I wanted to cover. Just move my camera a bit. Okay, so this is my sharpening station, and for those of you who do a lot of hand tool work and are and know about sharpening, I'll just say that this is probably the best thing about my sharpening station, is that it's right next to my workbench here, and over here, this is the finest grit waterstone that I have, and I leave it set up all the time. And so the key is that this makes sharpening very convenient. So the only reason that I'm not sharpening is because I'm just being stupid and lazy. But without getting into all the details of the sharpening setup that I have, in many ways it's actually pretty much like any other sharpening setup that that you guys might have. Basically, what I have is a relatively coarse waterstone here, and then this is a more medium grit waterstone, and then this is a fine grit waterstone. If you want to put numbers on it, this is about this is a 1,000 grit Sharpen professional waterstone. It's fantastic. It cuts really fast, and it feels nice when I use it. I just love it. These two are actually natural Japanese waterstones. You don't have to use natural Japanese waterstones, and the only reason I have them because it is number one, I was curious about them, and number two, I found bargains on eBay. and if I had to pay a lot for these guys, I probably wouldn't have them at all. But my sharpening routine is pretty straightforward. If I'm at a point where I need to use the coarsest grit waterstone, I'll just start by this, and you can see by all the marks that on the waterstone, I hope here, that I've used this recently, and I haven't flattened it out or anything. So that's one of the first things that I'll do. This is a diamond plate, that I use for flattening the water stones, and it's just really a matter of going like this and going like this. Until the marks have gone away. Now here's one thing that I think is a turnoff for people who might be interested in Japanese tools, is that there are people out there that are really into sharpening. I mean, they are really, really into sharpening. And I'm not, for me personally, I'm not too precious about it. But this is one of those things where I think the idea of flattening your water stones, I know that some people think of that as being like, very fanatical about your sharpening routine, and why would anyone want to do that? And basically the reason you want to keep your water stones flat is that it makes your sharpening faster. And the reason for that is that if the water stones have, like if this one had some curvature in it, and that one had some curvature in it, and that one had some curvature in it just from normal use and wearing out, and if the curvatures were different, then I will have to spend more time at each step getting from one step to the next. Whereas if I make sure that all of them are flat, then I know that I'm using a flat surface as my first step in sharpening. And then the second and third steps like go by very, very quickly, because I don't have to worry about the bevel not matching up with the profile of the water stone. And I hope you can see that the process of flattening a water stone is actually pretty fast. I don't know how long I took, but I know it was less than 30 seconds, and I'm ready to go. So one of the other, so when I'm sharpening a chisel, I basically do the same thing that anybody would do with a chisel. I work a little bit on the back. Like that. Until I was satisfied that I did a good job on the back side of the chisel. And then I'll work on the bevel side. And now here's one thing that I do that not everybody does, but I think it helps out a lot. I don't know if you saw the pattern that, I took note of the pattern that I had before I flattened out the surface of the water stone, but I do kind of do, instead of doing big long strokes up and down, what I'll do is I'll find my bevel here, and I'll go across, and then I'll go down and go across, and go down and go across, and then go down and go across. And I'm just doing little strokes here. And I don't know how much you can see this, but the idea is I'm trying to use up the whole surface of the water stone as evenly as I can, and that will help keep the water stone flat. You also notice that I'm not really using a jig here, and this is again one advantage that I see with the Japanese chisels over Western chisels, that it's actually easier to freehand these guys compared to a Western chisel. Part of the reason is that your typical Japanese chisel, top to bottom, is going to be thicker, which means this bevel is going to be wider, which means it's actually easier to register the bevel on your sharpening equipment. The other thing is that it is true that the hard layer is harder than your typical Western chisel, but the soft layer is really, really soft. And so as I'm sharpening this thing, I really only have to contend with about 3/16 of an inch of the hard steel, and the soft stuff over here, it just like wears away like nobody's business. And that's also, I think, an advantage that Japanese chisels have when it comes to sharpening, because you actually have to sharpen less hard steel than your typical Western chisel, which is made out of a single piece of tool steel. Okay, so so basically what I would do is I keep working on the bevel until I notice that there's a burr there, because that's how you know you're completely done. And you can feel for the burr, but because of the nature of the hard steel, the burrs tend to be very, very small. And so I don't make any apologies for this. What I use is a little jeweler's loop if I'm wondering what's going on. And I can just look at the thing and and see what the edge looks like. And that's actually a very easy way of directly seeing if you're getting completely to your edge at this stage of sharpening. This thing I picked up on eBay, and if you want one of these things, you just go to eBay and type in 20X jeweler's loop LED. And you'll find a bunch of these, and you can get them shipped to your door for like $12. I don't know how they do that, but that's what it is. And again, I'm not being fanatical about my edges by looking at them with the microscope. I just think that for a hobbyist who doesn't do this all the time, directly looking at your edge is actually a very good way of seeing what's happening as you sharpen. And now I'm at the point where I don't do that all the time, but if I'm ever having trouble, I'll go to that. And then once that's done on my 1000 grit stone, then I would go to my medium grit stone and then my final grit stone. It's basically the same process. Work a little bit on the back and then work on the bevel, and then make sure that I've obliterated the scratch pattern from the previous sharpening step. And this is, like I said before, this is where making sure that all of my water stones are flat allows me to like go through this very quickly, because I found that if I have to start with my 1000 grit water stone, I'll spend like maybe 75% of my time on this guy, and then the remaining time is split between the other two, because it just goes by so much more quickly because I'm going from one flat surface to the next. Does that make sense? Hope so. Okay. As far as why I use water stones, it is basically because the steel is so hard. You can sharpen Japanese chisels on oil stones. Bob Rosaski is a good friend of mine. He's done some writing for Popwood and has his own blog and YouTube channel on hand tools, and he uses oil stones. And he's actually successfully sharpened Japanese chisels on oil stones. It just takes longer. That's the main thing. The reason I don't use oil stones is because I'm not that patient, knowing that the oil stones will take more time. And the other thing is I just don't like the idea of oil being all over the place. But that's just me. You can also use diamond plates as well. But again, for me, diamond plates give me this fingernails on the blackboard sense that I really don't like. So that's why I don't use them. The other thing is that the diamond plates don't get up to as fine grits as you can with a water stone. So my feeling is that nobody loves to sharpen. Well, I mean, there are people out there that love to sharpen, but I'm not going to be one of them. And that most people will pick the sharpening system that annoys them the least. And for me, that's water stones, because everything has some sort of annoyance, with them, but water stones seem to match up with Japanese tools very well, because they're so aggressive, and they'll help you sharpen actually very, very quickly.
What were the grits of the other two stones?
Let's see. So the other two stones, they're about the middle one is about 4,000 grit, and the other one is somewhere above 10,000. I know this mainly from because I actually have a set of, I actually have a 5,000 grit water stone and an 8,000 grit water stone. Those were the first ones that I bought. But when I compare the grit pattern, the scratch pattern that each stone leaves, I can get a gauge as to what my natural water stones are like. So that's where I'm at. It may sound like going to a water stone grit above 10,000 is like too far. I mean, I don't know what that, first of all, I don't know what that means, because it's just my last step in sharpening. But from a logical perspective, if you take a look at grit sizes for water stones that are 8,000, 10,000 grit on up, the abrasive particles are somewhere around a half a micron, which actually turns out to be about the same diameter as the abrasive particles as the green compound that people use for stropping. If anyone out there uses a leather strop in the green compound, and I think it's just because our brains are not used to these units, and so when we're faced with a number like 8,000 or 10,000, it just seems like very, very extreme to us, because we're humans and that's just how our brains are wired. Because I've often heard conversation like, well, what do you finish up with stropping? And somebody says, well, I use green compound with a leather strop. And they say, oh, you must be a very well-versed woodworker if you can use a strop very very easily. But then if you say I use a 10,000 grit water stone, people look at you oddly, like, what kind of a, extremist are you in terms of your sharpening routine? But we're really talking about exactly the same things in terms of the abrasive size. So, any other questions on the sharpening routine?
How do the natural stones wear?
They wear about the same. So basically, if you use water stones, you'll know that the lower grit ones wear more quickly than the higher grit ones. and I find the same is true with the natural grit water stones as well. The medium one doesn't wear anywhere as quickly as the 1000 grit, but the finer one wears even less quickly than that. Now, I want to be clear. Again, I don't think anyone needs to go out and buy natural Japanese water stones to use Japanese tools. If you pick up a set of Shaptons, like 1,000 and 5,000 and 8,000 or 12,000 to finish up with, I think that's perfectly fine, and those are great. That's a great option. There are many other water stone manufacturers out there if you get on the internet and look around. But if you just sort of aim for 1,000, 4,000, 10,000, or as high as you can go, I think that's actually pretty good. And I don't see that much distinction between the various man-made water stones out there. In case you're wondering, the biggest thing that I feel when I'm using a natural water stone versus a man-made one is that, as you might imagine, with the higher grit man-made water stones, they're harder, and so keeping the bevel on is a little bit more tricky because it just tends to skate around more. Whereas with the natural water stones, there's not so much of that tendency. And it's hard to describe unless you actually try it out, but I liken the difference to the Stanley plane that you've picked up at a flea market and tuned up yourself, and a Lee Nielsen hand plane. They'll both do the same job, but like when you spin the little wheel on the Lee Nielsen one, it just feels so much better than the one on the Stanley, if that makes sense.
Question about the angle that these blades typically are on, 25 degrees, and do you ever consider a secondary bevel on Japanese tools?
Yeah, so basically, in terms of bevel angles, the ones that I use are pretty much the same as what everybody else has used. Most people will set up a bench chisel at about 30 degrees. Mortise chisel at 35 degrees. I think I mentioned that before. And my paring chisels are set up at 25 degrees, which pretty much is in line with paring chisels and bench chisels and mortise chisels in the Western world. In terms of using a micro bevel, I don't do that. Now, it's not necessarily that you can't put a micro bevel on a Japanese chisel, but the way that I look at it is that, number one, a micro bevel, I think, is used either if you hollow grind or if you just sort of grind it at one angle and put a secondary bevel on it. Either way, the main reason you're using that is to get around the issue that a Western chisel is made out of a single piece of tool steel. So there's no lamination, there's no soft layer that's going on here. And so by using a micro bevel, you're reducing the amount of work that you have to do to get a nice sharp, cutting edge. Because if you put a hollow in there and use that as a micro bevel, you're only sharpening like that much of the bevel. Or if you've ground this to like a certain degree and then you go up a little bit and you do a micro bevel that way, again, you're sharpening a little bit of less steel there. But when I see people who use micro bevels, they typically wind up being, at least an 1/8 of an inch, maybe 3/16 of an inch thick very quickly. And that's actually about the same dimension as this hard layer of steel that's on a Japanese chisel. So because most of this bevel is actually soft steel, and it's so soft that when you're sharpening, you don't even have to worry about that in terms of wearing that away. All you have to do is just pay attention to, keeping pressure on the tip so that the hard steel is being worn away. If you use a micro bevel on a Japanese chisel, you're trying to solve a problem with sharpening that actually doesn't exist because of the thinness of the hard steel lamination. The other reason I don't do them is because and this may just be me, but I think it's true for a lot of people, is that when I look at the bevel of a Japanese chisel and I see the lamination line there and it's like nice and symmetric and clean and tight, that looks pretty good. And if this whole bevel is flat, it's just makes it an attractive tool to use. If you put a little micro bevel across the front of this, and I did that once in order to take a picture when I was writing an article just to make a point, and then I got rid of it as quickly as I could. You then have this other facet on the bevel, and then it just makes the tool look bad. And I don't think our tools should look bad. I think they should look nice. So Mike Pekovich from Fine Woodworking puts a micro bevel on his Japanese chisels. And every time I see him, I ask him if he's still doing it. And he goes, yes. And I said, you do realize that it makes the tool look worse, right? And he goes, yes. And then I said, okay, just keep that in mind. and then when I run into him next time, I ask him about his chisels. And then he says, I am trying to just do the one bevel, but don't look in my toolbox. So yeah, that's kind of what happens, I suppose. But basically, in all seriousness, I've never found the need to use a micro bevel because I don't see how that's going to help me with my sharpening routine. And I think part of it is because of the fact that the hard layer is so thin compared to what we would have to do with the Western chisel.
I have a question for you in reference to your water stones.
Yeah.
When you're storing them, do you store them underwater? Or you just moisten them occasionally when you go to use them?
No, let's see. So I saw this little spray thingy I use. You can get this from Lee Valley in the garden section. But basically, I fill this up with water, you pump it up, and then you press the trigger, and then water shoots out. The water stones that I have, I can just, they're pretty much splash and go.
Okay.
Yeah. There are some Japanese water stones that require soaking. I've used them. First of all, they tend to be the lower grit. So you're talking about like the 800 grit or 1000 grit water stone. Typically, the higher grit water stones don't need soaking. But the ones that I have soaked, if I knew I was going to use it, the first thing I would do is just take it and stick it in that tub with the blue lid that I have over there, and just drop it in. And at the bottom of the tub, I just have 2 pieces of wood, so it's not resting flat on the bottom because I want water to get from the underside. And after about 15 minutes, it's ready to go. So it's not like if you have one of those Japanese water stones that requires soaking, that it takes a huge amount of time. I just got in the habit of when I was using that particular water stone, the first thing I did when I come to my shop is just dunk it in the water. And then I'll be puttering around, forgetting like what it was I was supposed to do. And by the time I remember what it was that I was supposed to do, the water stone's ready to go. So it's really not that big of an issue.
The Japanese plane irons have a hollow in the back as well?
Yeah, they do. So this is a Japanese plane iron. You can see, hopefully, that there's a lamination again. So there's the hard steel layer, and on the backside there's a hollow there. But yeah, the same principle is in play. The idea is that you just need a thin layer of hard steel at the cutting edge, and the rest of it can be soft metal. So that makes sharpening again very easy compared to a Western plane blade that is going to be made out of a single piece of steel. The blade also is thicker. So again, that makes the bevel more pronounced, which means that when I'm sharpening this thing, it's very easy to find the bevel and just work on it without necessarily having to use a jig. Since we're talking about sharpening chisels, the question, often comes up, well, if I'm working on the bevel here, I'll eventually wear away the steel and get into this hollow area. And then what do? Do you have to throw it away? You'd be surprised how often I was asked the question about it. Are the Japanese chisels disposable after you get rid of this first, 1/8 of an inch or so? And the answer is no, because basically, if you notice, when I first started working on my on the chisel during the sharpening demonstration, the first thing I did is I went on the back and worked at the tip of the chisel a little bit. And by doing that, what'll happen is is that you'll increase the flat area on the back of the chisel. Now the question then might be, well, then how come the hollow doesn't completely go away? And this is actually a very clever aspect of Japanese chisels. The hollow is not the same depth all the way across. It's actually shallower up here and it's deeper over here. So if you're flattening the entire back, then yeah, this part of the hollow will go away because it's shallower, but the deep end is still going to be there because basically it's deeper. That's different from Japanese planes where the hollow is pretty much the same depth all the way across from left to right and front to back. And so you have to do this procedure called tapping out to take care of that, which is beyond the scope of today's talk. But for chisels, it's not really a thing that you have to worry about. I think it is actually very clever, a clever design. And just so you know, the hard layer goes all the way back to here, the shoulder of the chisel, which means that the chisel is actually usable even if you sharpen down to like this, to this much. I've actually seen chisels that the woodworker must really like because they literally have just this much left and it's still in the toolbox and it's still being used. So if you want to talk about frugal woodworkers, I think that's a pretty clear and good example of being frugal with your tools. You're getting like every last inch of use out of this.
Could you talk about differences in quality and price points?
Yep. Let's see. So, yeah. So what I have here is a set of 3 Japanese chisels. I found them on eBay. The package has a nice little card. It's very pretty. It's got some bamboo leaves on it. But when I was shopping for this group of Japanese chisels, my only concern was cost, because I actually wanted to find out, well, what is it that you get when you're buying a Japanese chisel, and what are you getting for your money? And so when I was looking for the set, what I was looking for the cheapest one possible. And I got this set of Japanese chisels shipped to my door for like $28 for 3 chisels. But once I got it in my hands, so once I got it in my hands, I actually compare it to one of my nicer Japanese chisels and see what the differences were. So maybe I should just start talking about the chisels that I use all the time. So these chisels I bought from a store called Hita Tool. They're located in Berkeley, California. They have a website, and I bought all of these online. These chisels are made by a guy named Chituro Imai, and the brand name for these chisels is Fuji Hero Chisel. So oftentimes when you hear about Japanese chisels, you'll hear the name of the blacksmith and the name of the chisel. The reason I got these is because it's not because I found some sort of head-to-head comparison of all these different Japanese chisels and I bought the winner of the shootout. A lot of people actually asked me if I want to do that, and I said, and my usual answer is no, because I have better things to do with my time. But in terms of, but what I did at the time was number one, I read up on like anybody's experience with Japanese chisels. And for the ones that were readily available in the US, this was one of the ones that nobody ever had a negative comment about. The most popular ones at the time was sold through the Japan Woodworker catalog, and now they're part of Woodcraft, and they're the Matsumura chisels. And most people like those, except every so often I run across a report from someone who wasn't really happy with his Matsumura chisel. There weren't that many of those reports, but it kind of gave me an idea of what they were performing like. So like I said, number one, this brand of chisel was one that I never heard a negative comment about. Second was price, because at the time they were priced about $50 to $60 per chisel, more than what it's certainly more than what you can spend for a chisel, but it also placed them pretty much in line with what Lee Nielsen was pricing the chisels at the time, and also the nicer chisels at Lee Valley. So I thought that was a reasonable price point. The other thing about this particular blacksmith is that he makes these chisels, and these are sort of his regular chisels, but he also makes a high-end line of chisels. And I got this as a gift. Someone was nice enough to give this to me, but you can tell that there's some differences here. I mean, the handle is made out of a species of ebony. It's not like the black ebony, but this is a ebony species. And this is something I'm pretty sure is not going to show up on camera, but I'm going to try. If you look really closely at the bevel, you'll actually see these little lines that go across. And that's because the soft layer is not just soft steel, it's actually laminated soft steel, and it gives us this little stripy quality that is pretty. It's not as apparent on this chisel because it's only a 3mm chisel, but it's much more apparent on the wider chisels. This is all for aesthetics. It does nothing for the performance of the chisel, but it does look really nice. And so that made me feel good, because if I figured if this blacksmith could turn out a fancy chisel like this, then he must know his blacksmithing pretty well. So what I did was I went ahead and bought one of those, and I tried it out, and I liked it a lot. And because I liked it a lot, I just started buying more chisels. Now, in terms of price points, I think if you're looking at chisels between the $50 to $150 per chisel range, you actually will be getting more for your dollar in terms of the chisel's performance. And basically, what I specifically mean by that is your ease of sharpenability and how durable the edge will be once you get it sharp. Because this is where the skill of the blacksmith comes into play. And I actually have a little explanation as to how this actually works. Once you get above that $150, $200 range, now you're generally paying for aesthetics more than anything else. And certainly the chisels will be very good in terms of using, but you're paying for how nice the chisel looks in the fancy ebony handles or rosewood handles or whatever it is that they're giving you. So that's what I generally say in terms of guidance. Now I know that there are going to be a number of options at whatever price point you might be looking at. And my usual advice in terms of trying to make that choice is that if you go out on the internet, you'll find that there are different tool sellers of Japanese chisels out there, and they all carry different brands. First of all, you don't have to worry that one guy is selling a really nice chisel and the next guy is selling a piece of crap, because all these chisels work really, really well. But I think the best way to start is to just contact all the tool sellers that you can find. And if you go to my website, there's actually a resources page where I have a list of all the Japanese tool sellers that can speak English and sell you tools online. And just say, I'm looking for a Japanese chisel. And if it's your first one, just tell them it's your first one, and then tell them what type of woodworking you use. What kind of woods do you use for your projects? What kind of projects are you making? Are you making primarily furniture pieces? Are you making small boxes? And so on. And then say, tell me which chisel you would recommend for me and why. And you'll get a bunch of different answers. One of those guys is going to give you an answer that is going to resonate with you. And then what you should do is buy a chisel from that tool seller. Because basically, it's not the chisel that you're buying at this point. What you're buying is a relationship with a tool seller that understands what you need and can explain it to you in a way that you find understandable. And I know this is way different than how we usually make our tool purchases, because what we're supposed to do, I suppose, is look at all the different brands out there and then do your research and then do a head-to-head comparison and pick out the best one. And this is completely different, but it's a way of doing this that works, because it's worked, because I find that it works for me. And it gives you something that that is actually pretty hard to find, which again is a tool supplier that really understands what you want and what you need. Did that answer your question?
How are the $28 chisels?
Yes.
Oh yeah, sorry, completely forgot about that part. Yeah, so this is kind of hilarious. So one thing that I haven't done is that I haven't really sharpened these things up to put them to use. But number one, if I look at this, there seems to be a lamination line on the front, on the bevel here. And there is a hollow on the backside that I can see. But I'm hoping, let me see if I can catch the light right. I think what you can see is that the grinding of this tool is not the best. The bevel is actually convex. It's not concave and it's not flat. And you can see like the grinding on the bottom side is pretty coarse. The other thing that you'll see is that, you know, the amount of detail that was paid to the parts of the chisel that are, you know, not so functional, like, you know, the shoulders are pretty roughly ground and they just come to a corner here, whereas the shoulder on this chisel here is much more nicely shaped and it's more comfortable to hold if I'm grabbing the chisel by the blade over here. The sides of this chisel basically go straight up and then straight across and then straight down the other side, whereas this chisel has a bevel. So that's what you're paying for. So that's what the difference between the $28 and the $55 that this chisel cost me when I bought it. That's what you're paying for, is the extra amount of time and attention spent to the details of the chisel that make it a nicer to use tool. May not be completely functional, but I would actually still argue that if it's more comfortable for me to hold this chisel like this than this one, then all that shaping actually does serve a function. So, oh, the other thing I found out is that the hoop on this chisel is kind of laughable because it's basically not a solid piece of metal. It's basically a piece of sheet steel that's been bent around to form a hoop. And then, I don't know if you can see the inside here, but it sort of comes up from the underside and then it's just, you know, a raw edge on the top. Whereas a proper hoop should be a solid piece of metal like this. And this one has these facets that were hand hammered in. It's, you know, they're kind of nice again to look at. But the other thing about these hoops is that if you, this is one of the things where you really have to feel it to appreciate it. But I'll describe what I'm feeling here. The inside of the hoop down at the bottom basically goes straight up and down. And then as I go up to the top, it flares out like that. And that's why when you fit the hoop of a chisel, when you first set it up, you're going to be pounding the fibers. And I'll show this in more detail, but you'll be pounding the fibers. And so the slope at the top end gives a place for the fibers to bend out and lock the hoop in place. I don't really see how that's going to work very well with this chisel. I mean, there's a little bit of a bevel that's just been pressed into the steel, but it's nothing really to speak of. So that's what you get for your 28 bucks. I'm going to go back to the slideshow because there's some aspects of the Japanese steel that I think if you understand that, you'll really get a feel for, you know, why these chisels work so well. Okay, so with this diagram, I made this illustration again just to show what happens with the hollow of a chisel as you sharpen it. So the top part of this figure, oh, can you see this?
No, I'm not seeing it.
No, sorry, I forgot to start the sharing. Now, can you see this? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So in the top figure, that's sort of a side profile of a Japanese chisel. The white represents the hard layer, the darker layer represents the soft layer. And you can see that from the profile of the hollow, this is quite a bit exaggerated from the real life situation, but I exaggerated just so you can see it. You can see that the hollow is relatively shallow at the cutting edge and becomes deeper as you move towards the back. So the second figure is what happens after you've been sharpening the chisel for a while and you move into the hollow and you lose that flat area. Well, if you then flatten out the back, you'll basically be raising the bottom, and then you'll reestablish the flat at the tip of the chisel. But the hollow will still remain because, again, the hollow at the back side is going to be deeper than than the front side. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the steel, because this is actually where a lot of the cost of a Japanese chisel goes into. I don't know how much you guys know about steel, but I promise I'm going to make this pretty painless. So when you make steel, steel is basically iron and carbon. And iron and carbon come in different forms. You certainly have iron ore, like in the Sheffield area of England, and that's why Sheffield became such a big tool making concern, when the Industrial Revolution came along. But in Japan, they didn't have iron mines as such. What they did have was iron-rich sand. And what the other thing they had was trees that they could then use to make charcoal, which is where the carbon is going to come from. And what you see in the picture on the right-hand side is basically a blast furnace that's made in the making of the hard tool steel that's used in Japanese tools and in samurai swords, for that matter, because this was what was the same process was used for making Japanese swords as well. So what they used to do is they would build this big clay structure that looked like a big kiln or oven, and this would take up the size of a medium-sized building. It would be easily 40 feet long and maybe 20 feet wide, so it's actually bigger than my shop. And then what they would do is they would load it up with a whole bunch of charcoal and a whole bunch of this iron-rich sand, and then they would set it on fire. And then they had a team of people that took shifts round the clock, making sure that the fire wasn't burning too quickly or not quickly enough for a few days. And then they just watch this thing burn for 3-4 days or so. And then at the end, they would let the fire go out, and then they would just take some bunch of sledgehammers and break apart the big clay structure and dig through to see what they had. And basically what they would find were these little nuggets of metal, and this is actually carbon steel in a very raw form. Now, this is clearly not a precision operation, and what they would then do was they would take these hunks of steel and they'd chip at it and they'd look at it and see how it sparks, and then they would start sorting them out, because some of them would have would be very, very hard, but also very brittle, and the others might be not so hard, but you couldn't crack them in half. And so so even though they didn't know exactly what they were doing, from a scientific level, they knew enough that they knew that they would get different pieces and different properties of steel through this process, and so they would sort through them. Now, what this is a phase diagram for steel, and you don't have to know everything that's in that. All you really have to understand is that at the bottom on the x-axis is the percentage of carbon that's going to go into the steel, and on the y-axis is the temperatures that you hit as you heat it up and you cool it back down. And basically, the things that you have to that I want you to take away from this is that. Is that if you start down at the bottom at room temperature and you start heating the steel up, the carbon and iron will start interacting and go through different phases. And then when you get to a particular phase at a particular temperature, then you start cooling it back down, and then that's when you're going to start to form the actual steel. And that the various lines, again, all I want you to take away from this is that if you don't have enough carbon, then you're going to get a different product than if you have a lot of carbon. And if you put in too much carbon, you're going to get a different product as well. These are little molecular diagrams of what's actually happening in the carbon iron mixture. So basically, iron is represented by the black dots in the top two figures there. And if you ever dealt with a piece of raw iron, you know that you can bend it and it'll stay bent, and then you can bend it back and it'll be straight again, and it's not really going to break. Well, that's because iron atoms naturally like to arrange themselves into a cubic structure. But the cubic structure isn't solid. It can slide back and forth, and that's why you're able to bend metal. The reason carbon is important in making steel is that carbon just happens to be the right size, that if you can jam it in either into the center of the cube or in the faces of the cube, it'll actually solidify the structure and make it very stiff. and this is what's called a carbide. So we often think of carbides as little chunks that are sitting on the tip of a table saw blade or a bandsaw blade, but carbides actually do exist on microscopic levels, and this is what's happening when that happens. So this is a picture of a samurai dagger, again from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the key thing about this dagger is that it was made in the 1300s, and the lamination, and this dagger is made with the same principle. You have this very hard layer of steel that's been forge welded to a softer layer of steels on both sides, and the lamination is perfect. I mean, it's like perfectly even from along the length of the dagger, and there are no gaps or weirdness going on. It's just a beautiful thing to behold. But whatever your appreciation is for Japanese aesthetics when it comes to their knives, what to me this really says is that this whole process of taking hard layers of steel and soft layers of steel and forge welding them together, this is actually solved technology, and at least by the 1300s. There may be earlier Japanese weapons that have the same thing that were made earlier, but this is the earliest one that I could find. And if you compare what was going on in Japan with what was going on in the Western world in the 1300s, it's pretty remarkable that this sort of thing was being made in Japan while the Western, most of Europe was still working their way through the Dark Ages back then. Okay, so when we talk about steel, there are trade-offs, and I alluded to this before. The first one is hardness versus toughness. Hardness is what you want in something with an edge that you're going to be cutting things with, because this will allow your edge to stay sharp for a longer period of time. But the trade-off is that that thing is also going to be pretty brittle. Toughness is good, but steel that is made so that it's tough, so it'll bend rather than break, it's not going to maintain an edge very long. So what you do is you snack the two together. The soft layer is tough, and the hard layer is, well, hard. But by backing the hard layer of steel with the tougher, softer layer of steel, that's what keeps your Japanese chisel from cracking in half when you use it. It actually is possible to take a Western chisel and harden it to the same degree that you would that a Japanese chisel would be, but remember, that's all a single piece of tool steel, and so therefore the blade would be very likely to crack if you're going to do this. Now, what happens in terms of the hardness versus toughness is the carbon content of the steel and whether or not you throw any alloys into the steel. If you know anything about Japanese tools, you've probably heard this white steel, blue steel thing, and this is basically a diagram to show what the differences are. So this is modern day tool manufacturing, and the raw material is JASSK carbon steel, which is carbon steel and in a pretty raw form. It's not really good for anything, and so you have to do stuff to it to make it better. So one of the first things that the tool makers do is they take the raw carbon steel and they start removing impurities, and they generate what they call yellow steel number 2. This is the type of steel that's often used in Japanese saws. If you then further refine it and remove more impurities, then you come up with white steel number 2. And at this point, it's almost pure iron and carbon with maybe a little bit of impurities that are still left over, but really not too much at all at this point. If you then take white steel number 2 and add more carbon to the mix, then you get white steel number 1. So it's just a higher carbon version of white steel number 2. If you take the white steel and add alloying agents, basically tungsten and chromium, then you come up with blue steel number 2, which because it's an alloy, you can actually make it harder, and it will have more edge retention, but at the expense of ease of sharpenability to some extent. And then if you take blue steel number 2 and you add carbon, tungsten, and chromium in higher quantities, then you can get blue steel number 1. Now, the colors don't refer to the steel itself. You can't eyeball any of these things and tell which one is white steel and which one is blue steel. It actually refers to the wrapper that they wrap up the steel in when they ship it out for sale. So the white steel comes in a white wrapper and the blue steel comes in a blue wrapper. That's basically where that comes from. Now, in terms of the differences in between here, I've put together this chart showing the differences between O1 and A2, which are two common steels that are used for Western woodworking tools, and compared them to white steel number 1, white steel number 2, and blue steel 1 and 2 as well. And if you look at the top row, you can see that O1 has about 0.95% carbon, and A2 has somewhere a little bit higher carbon content. But white steel number 1 and white steel number 2 have carbon contents that are higher than what you find in O1 and A2. And the same is true for blue steel 1 and 2 as well. Now, it may not look like a whole lot of difference, but if you actually work out the math, we're talking about 10 to 40% more carbon in the Japanese steels compared to the Western steels. And again, if you buy into this idea that iron and carbon are what makes up the carbides, and that's really what gives the steel its hardness properties, then having 10 to 40% more carbon, and therefore potentially 10 to 40% more carbides in the steel could allow you to make that steel harder than you would be able to with the commonly used Western tool steels. And the other point that I like to make is if you don't think that 10% makes that much of a difference, you've never been in front of a woodcraft when they have their 10% off everything sale. You know, us woodworkers love that 10% thing. Okay, so when I think about steel, I think about this. Why? Because I like food, I like eating. And when I think about steel, I actually think about blueberry muffins, where the blueberries are the carbides that are forming through the steel making process and the heat treating process. And then the muffin part is the matrix that holds all the carbides in place. I hope that makes sense. Well, as it turns out, these carbides actually have will settle out on a particular size, and this is a combination of how you treat the steel as you make it and the alloys that you put into it. And if you go and look up material data sheets on A2 and O1 steel, what you'll find out is that A2 steel is, you can expect the carbides to be about 13 microns in diameter, and O1 to be about 10 microns in diameter. And in this picture, I actually scaled the carbides to represent what they would be if they were, you know, if they were actually 13 and 10 as we're looking at them. And then what the lines are supposed to represent is the cutting edge of your chisel. And as you can see, between these two tool steels, it seems like the smaller carbide that you get from the O1 steel will allow you to hone your chisel to a finer edge, a finer degree than you can with the A2, because the carbide is just physically larger there. And if you talk to people who've tried out both A2 and O1 steels, you'll find that you know, they may not know about the you know, carbide size or any of the metallurgy stuff that we've been going through, but they will tell you things like this. Oh, you know, I like my paring chisels to be made out of O1 because I can feel I can get a finer edge out of them. Or I like using A2, but I find that I have to sharpen it with a higher bevel angle, maybe going to like 32 or 33 instead of 30, because if I sharpen it to 30, then the edge crumbles too quickly. And that may be because with such a shallow degree angle, those carbides are just popping out at the edge of the chisel. Okay, so hopefully this works. What this is going to be is a little video of what happens when a Japanese blacksmith is making a tool. Now, this is going to be a plain blade, but the principles are the same between how you make a plain blade and a chisel. Okay, so what you're seeing here, that little square is the hard steel, and he's dipping it in some fluid and some flux there, so it's nice and well coated. And then he's going to put that on top of a softer layer of steel, which is the bigger thing that he's got. And it's already heated up, so there's a little steam coming off of it already, and he's making sure he's got good contact there. So now what he does is he goes and sticks it into a charcoal furnace. Now, at this point, you may have heard stories about Japanese blacksmith working in the dark. And here, what he's doing is he's taking it now that the steel has all been heated up, and he's just pounding the crap out of it to forge weld the pieces together. Now, remember the phase diagram where you had to hit different temperatures to make sure that the steel is being heated properly? There's no thermometer here, but what the blacksmith can see is color. And as you know, if you start heating up metal, it'll start changing color, and the color that you see is actually representative of the temperature that you're at. So that's why you hear these stories about these guys working in the dark, because if you're trying to see the color of the heated up metal and you have a big, LED light bulb behind you, the light from the LED bulb is going to wipe out the color that you're trying to identify. And so they're basically doing by eye what we can do with laser thermometers. But again, these guys are so skilled at what they do that they can look at the color and know when it's correct or not. And I found that when I talk to people who do blacksmithing, either as a hobby or, say at historical reenactment places like, place down in Virginia. Blanking on the name. That place. Williamsburg, thank you. Yeah. So those guys will actually talk about the same thing. Yeah, I know what color I want this piece of steel to get up to before I start hammering away at it, because if I let it go too long, it's not going to come out right. And if I don't let it go that high, then it's not going to come out right either. Okay, so but the forge welding does more than just slam the two pieces of steel together. What that actually does is, remember the carbides that we've been talking about? Now imagine those carbides sitting in the steel that's now been heated up. So it's not fluid, but it's not completely stiff either. And then you start smacking it with a hammer. And when you smack it with a hammer, those carbides actually start shattering into smaller and smaller bits, and they become more evenly distributed throughout the steel itself. So if you ever did one of those sand art things where you put the different colors of sand in layers and then you shook it up, it's the same sort of process. So what happens is that instead of blueberry muffins, I now start thinking about in terms of Japanese tools. I start thinking about lemon poppy seed muffins, where the carbides are now smaller and they're more evenly distributed, but still held in the matrix. And then if we go back to the diagram that I was showing you before here, and here, this takes a little bit of a leap of faith, but I think I'm right on, because I've talked to people and no one has told. I've talked to a lot of people about this idea, including people who know metallurgy and how steel is manufactured, and no one has told me that I'm wrong about this. But I don't know the size of the carbides that comes in a typical Japanese chisel or plane blade. I haven't been able to find a reference for that, but I have found a reference to the carbide sizes that are in Damascus swords, the ones that were made around the year 1000 when the Crusades are going on. And they've analyzed those, and the carbides are about 3 microns in diameter. And the process by which Damascus swords are made is pretty much exactly like what I've shown you, the hard layer and surrounded by the soft layer and the forge welding and whatnot. So if I take this diagram and I drop in a bunch of 3 micron carbides, that's what you see. And this explains visually to me a lot of the properties that Japanese steels seem to have. So number one, you can sharpen them to a fine degree because you have these smaller carbides, and so that you'll get better support further out to the edge. It also explains why the edge retention is so long, because you have the support further out into the angle that's made by the bevel of your tool. It also explains why they're easier to sharpen. So ignore the big carbide that's sitting there that was left over from the previous diagram, but just imagine that you have a bunch of 3 micron carbides scattered throughout that tool. And let's say you need to sharpen it. Well, all you have to do is get some abrasive, your Waterstone, on that thing and knock away a bunch of tiny 3 micron carbides. That should be relatively easy compared to either popping out or slicing through a 10 or 13 micron carbide that you would find in Western tools. And so for me, this whole story about the higher carbon content and the forge welding resulting in smaller carbides, this explains why Japanese steels and Japanese tools seem to have the properties that they do. Is that clear? Because this is actually one of the take-home points that I'd like you guys to come away with. And if anybody has any questions, please shout out. Okay. Right. There's one other way of making metal that I just want to touch on briefly, and that's CPM, which is something powdered metal technology. And for this, it's quite a bit different, and this is a relatively recent development in terms of making steel. The first part is that you take all your raw materials and you just powderize them, so everything is like really small to start with, and then you mix them together. So you'll be adding your iron and your carbon and your alloying agents and all the rest of the stuff that goes into it. And so you can very finely control the combination of materials that you're using. After you mix them together, you get a bunch of granules, which then you stick into an injection molder, which then pops out a thing that is the shape of the thing that you want to make. And then there's debinding and sintering, and then you wind up with your final product. And probably the most well-known example of using this technology to make a tool is the PMV11 chisels that Lee Valley sells. And I've been really interested in seeing how these things are made, because if you talk to people that have used both the PMV11s and Japanese chisels, they'll describe them as having very similar properties, meaning that they're both relatively easy to sharpen. It seems like the Japanese steels are easier to sharpen than the PMV11, but they seem to take a very fine edge and they seem to hold it for a very long time. And so I've met Rob Lee from Lee Valley, and I was lucky enough once to take a tour of their facility up in Ottawa. And I asked them, so do you guys know what your carbide sizes are in this? And they say, we don't know that, but we'll get back to you. And then they never got back to me. But I did look into other CPM steels, because PMV11 is not the only CPM steel out there. And what I found is that the carbide sizes in other CPM steels that are typically used for woodworking tools are in the range of maybe 4 microns, 5 microns or so. So again, tinier than the O1 and A2 steels, and in the ballpark of the Japanese steel. So it's probably not a surprise that people are describing their behavior in similar terms. Of the people, though, that you have used both, they tend to give the edge to the Japanese chisels for what it's worth. Okay, so that's all the slideshow that I have for the most part. Let's see. I should talk a little bit about setting the hoop. And I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to completely demonstrate this, but I found that when I was demonstrating this, I would buy a new chisel and then set the hoop. And then I realized that I would have a whole lot of chisels sitting around that I wasn't going to use just to do a hoop demonstration. But I can show you the process by which you would do this. Okay, so when you get a Japanese chisel for the first time, oops, it's not sure. Okay, so when you get a Japanese chisel for the first time, the hoop will still be on it, but what you'll see is that the hoop is kind of flush with the top, and that's all that's going on. You're supposed to rectify the situation when you first get the chisel. So the first order of business is to pop the hoop off of the handle, and when that happens, you have your hoop sitting in your hand. And then, like I mentioned before, you can stick your finger inside the hoop, and you should be able to feel which half of the hoop is straight up and down and which half has the little flare out section at the top. And just make note of that, because you're going to want to know how that is when you put the hoop back on the chisel. At that point, with the handle being off, this isn't a hoop chisel, but I'll just use this for demonstration. There are a couple things you can do. Remember, the hoop was pretty tight when you first put it on. And what you want to do is make the situation so that the hoop is now, when you put the hoop back on the handle, it actually sits maybe about a 1/16 of an inch or 3/32 of an inch below where the top was. And there are a couple ways of doing that. One thing you can do is just take a knife and pare away at this a little bit, because then as you narrow the diameter, it'll allow the hoop to drop down a little bit further until you get to the depth that you want. One other method that's often used is you take a hammer, you just put this on some sort of solid surface, and you just pound it as you rotate the handle, and that'll actually physically compress the diameter a little bit, and then you can slip the hoop down so that it's sitting down a little bit lower. So this is a badly set hoop, but I like this one because it's good for this demonstration. So what you want to do is get to a point where the hoop is actually sitting below the top of the top of the handle. And then what you want to do is you want to just start hitting it, the handle, like so. And what I'm trying to do is exaggerate this so you can see this. But when I hit the corner, what I'm aiming for is the corner of the handle here. And I'm trying to, like, you know, bend the fibers out. If you want, you can either put a little bit of liquid on here to soften the fibers up, or sometimes, you know, people will actually just stick this in a cup of water just to soak the end, to help the fibers bend over better. And some people just do it dry. For me, I just do whatever works. If I find it's going too tough, then I add some liquid, and if it's not going well, then I'll just soak the end of the thing. But when you're done doing that, eventually what should happen is you get a situation like this. So compared to the way the hoop was when you started, where you can see the whole hoop sitting around the end of the handle, by mushrooming the fibers out, you actually, if you do this properly, you actually should not see the top of the hoop anymore. And the hoop is going to be really solidly stuck on at this point, because you've only compressed the handle or shaved away the handle just enough for the hoop to be firmly set on the bottom side, and then the mushrooming out of the fibers at the top locks it in from the top side, so that hoop's not going anywhere. The other advantage of this, and this is one thing I thought, that's why it would be great to have a bunch of paring chisels around, is that this actually makes the handle very comfortable to hold if you want to use a bench chisel for paring. So when I'm using this for paring, I'll typically grab the handle like so, with the end of the handle sitting in the palm of my hand, and then I'll have my other hand on the blade, and I'll use that to guide the chisel. So, you know, I can guide and push and guide and push and do whatever it is that I want to do with it. But by having the fibers of the handle mushroomed over here, I don't have the hoop of the chisel digging into my hand. It's actually very comfortable to hold it this way, even though we've got this piece of metal sitting here. I have run across people that complain that pairing with a bench chisel or something with a hoop on it they say it's uncomfortable, and that's why they don't like Japanese chisels. And then I say, well, did you mushroom over the top of the handle so that you cover up the hoop? And the usual answer is, say what? So that tells me that, yeah, if you have a hoop that's not set and you're trying to pair with it, I mean, I can actually feel right away that it's not going to be as comfortable as a hoop that's properly set. One last thing that, any questions on setting the hoop?
When you're setting the hoop, do you have the blade embedded in a piece of scrap, or?
No,
you hold it?
That's a very good question. No, I actually just hold it in the air and go like that.
Okay.
I know people that do that, but I've also seen people just hold it up in the air, and it works just fine for me. Just in terms of an expectation, you know, it should only take you about 10 minutes tops to set the hoop of a chisel. Like once you get the hang of it. I mean, and to be upfront, the first time I did this, it took me like a solid half hour. But then after that, the second one was faster, the third one was faster. And like I said, after a while, it just took me 10 minutes to set one up. And once you have it set up, you're done. You don't have to deal with that ever again. It's a one-time operation. Any other questions on the hoops? Let's see, one last thing I'd like to cover is like the whole, this whole hardwood, softwood thing when it comes to Japanese tools. This is something that I also hear often said about Japanese tools, is that you can't, you have to use them on softwoods and you can't use them on hardwoods. So since we're in the US and we have maple and cherry and oak and walnut, why would you ever use a Japanese chisel on a hardwood? And the answer to that is that that's actually just wrong. My first real experience with this, so I don't know if you guys, I don't know if Brian mentioned this at all, but my day job is that I'm a pediatric oncologist. And as such, there are many nights where I would be on call, and as such, there would be nights where it was late at night and I would be waiting for the ER to call me back on a patient. So there was no sense in trying to go back to sleep or anything because I knew I'd be woken up in not too long. And so back then, I would pass my time waiting for the ER by looking on woodworking forums. And on Sawmill Creek, I saw someone say something along the lines of, well, you know, the problem with Japanese chisels is that one chop in a piece of Kokobola and it's all over. And I'd been using Japanese chisels for a little while at that point, and that didn't seem true to me, but probably more to the point, since I was on call and it was late at night, I was really, really crabby. So what I did was, well, is that I knew I had a Kokobola bowl blank, so I just went and cut a couple notches out on the corner and chopped it as if I was chopping a mortise. And then I took some pairings on an end grain piece of pine, and it was perfect. And I posted them on the internet, and then that caused a lot of ruckus. The fact is, though, that in Asia, there's plenty of experience working with hardwoods. And certainly in China, because China has a strong furniture tradition, and the type of woods that were typically used was various rosewood species from Southeast Asia. In Japan, the furniture tradition wasn't as strong, but they certainly had lots of wooden objects that were made out of ebony or rosewood or things that were quite hard to deal with. And these were the tools that they were using. What I have found in terms of chisels specifically is if you're having trouble with maintaining the edge in the particular piece of wood that you're working with, the easy thing is to steepen the bevel angle. And likewise, if you're using end grain, if you're trying to work on end grain and you're getting a bunch of pop out because you're not slicing through the fibers fast enough, then what you can do is lower the angle. But that's really the only accommodation that you have to make in terms of using Japanese chisels with hardwood species. And for the most part, the bevel angles that I use, as I mentioned before, are pretty much right on with what happens with Western woodworking tools. People who use a lot of walnut and cherry, and those are my favorite woods to work with, their chisels are typically set at 30 degrees. If you're using a lot of oak, then you might steepen the bevel angle to 35 degrees or something like that. That's what Mike Pekovich does, but that's actually what a lot of other people who work in a lot of oak seem to do that I've talked to as well. And so that's really the only accommodation that you have to make if you're using a Japanese chisel and you're in a hardwood species. But I would also say that that's the same accommodation that you have to make for any chisel that you're working with. So basically, if you're worried that Japanese tools have to be used only with softwoods, that's really not an issue, especially as far as chisels are concerned. Okay, so I just want to go back to sharing my screen. I'm almost done here. Okay, so I'm bringing you back to that Bible box that I showed you at the beginning of this talk. As I said, this is a pretty traditional piece of American woodworking. Comes from the late 1700s and was well established in the colonial times. Outside of the feet of this box that I had to use my lathe to turn, every single part of this project was done with Japanese tools, even though it's a solidly Western project. The only accommodation that I had to make was that the molding around the molding at the bottom and around the lid is a different profile than the box that we were working off of. Because the molding, the profile that we had was sort of like an OG type of profile. And I couldn't do that with my Japanese tools. But that's not because Japanese tools aren't able to make an OG. It's really more an issue that in the Asian aesthetic, an OG just doesn't exist. And so there's no reason to make a tool that allows you to make a profile that you're never going to use. So as it turns out, what I did was there's a profile that sort of comes down and fill, and then there's a quarter circle, and then comes straight out at 90 degrees. And I just put that at the top and then the bottom of my molding. But I would guess that if I didn't tell you that story, you wouldn't suspect that I had to make any accommodations in terms of making this box. And so, you know, the big take-home message that I have for you guys is that Japanese tools, again, I think are great options in terms of woodworking. And there's actually nothing inherent about Japanese tools that wouldn't allow you to work and use them in your shop. For chisels in particular, I've only found 2 reasons why somebody might want to use a Western chisel as opposed to a Japanese chisel. The first, again, is the scale, because Japanese chisels tend to be shorter than their Western counterparts, and some people just like the bigger scale for whatever reason, and that's perfectly fine. That's personal preference. The only other reason, however, to use a Western chisel instead of Japanese chisels is you just like to sharpen more often and spend more time doing it, because I actually do think there's something to the durability of the edge. I mean, it's certainly been my experience, and I've tried out other Western chisels, and they just do not maintain an edge as long as my Japanese chisels do, and I do find them easier to sharpen than Western tools, again, because of the thin, hard layer and the fact that I only have to deal with maybe 3/16 of an inch of hard steel. So I think that's it. I do want to acknowledge a lot of people I've talked with over the years in terms of figuring this stuff out, because I certainly didn't come up with all of this on my own. And I've got a lot of great input in terms of the things I've been figuring out with the Japanese tools. So it gives me confidence that I'm not just, you know, telling you some cockamamie story. But I do think the issue that the tools really have more similarities than differences is a good thing to keep in mind. And Lord knows, with the events that we've been seeing over the past few months, that's probably a good approach to life in general. If you want more information, again, I have a blog. The website is called giantcypress.net. I like to think it's pretty useful. And if you have some time to waste, please feel free to come and look around. All of my contact information, my email, and whatnot is also on the blog. And there's a way of asking me a question through the blog itself. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. But that's what I've got.
Excellent.
I hope you liked it.
It was very good, very informative.
Excellent presentation.
Yes,
thank you.
wonderful, fascinating.
Okay.
Very good.
Can I add a little bit to what you were saying?
Sure.
In reference to chisels, in 1977, I was in the military, got assigned to a place called Okinawa, Japan. At that time, it was not part of Japan, it was Okinawa. And I was there maybe first 2 or 3 weeks. They had a hobby shop on the base. When I first got there, everybody was telling me, when you go off base to buy anything, you should pay in yen and not in dollars, because you get a better price. So I took $300, went to the exchange, had it changed into yen, and I went to a woodworking place. And I wanted to buy something. I didn't sure what it was. I don't know if you can see these, but the chisels that you were showing,
Yeah.
I have a set of 3 that I bought in 1977. The shop I went into, I introduced myself, but unfortunately nobody there spoke English, and obviously I didn't speak Japanese. And I tried to explain who I was, and the guy who ran the shop looked at me and nodded, and he said, Andy. And I said, no, Smokey. He said, oh, Andy. From there on, every time I went there, my name was Andy.
Okay.
I met his 6-year-old daughter a little while later, who spoke fluent English. She said that I look like the guy on Andy. And I said, Andy? And it was a show that they were watching from the United States, but it was in Japanese.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, the price for the tool at the time, I didn't know what it was. I had my money, so I show him all my yen, and he picks out so much yen from me. And it turns out I ended up paying $75 for that set. And I've had it now for 40 years. And I've sharpened them many times. And just like you said, at first I was afraid the bottom would go out after I sharpened them too many times. But if you flatten it, you're right, it stays exactly that way. I don't know what kind of steel it's made out of, everything on it is Japanese. I don't even know the name of the tools,
Mhm.
but they work exceedingly well.
Yeah.
Just a comment.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people like pay a lot of attention to the blacksmith name and whatnot. And there's actually a Facebook group of people who are interested in Japanese tools in general. I look at that, and the most common question that gets asked by someone new to the group is, "I have this chisel," and then there's a picture, and they say, "Who's the blacksmith?" And the answer is that actually probably doesn't matter a whole lot. One of the, I also forgot to mention that in terms of the white steel and the blue steel, a lot of people worry about that difference. And again, I don't think the difference is really that great. The analogy I like to use is trying to decide if your chisel should be made out of white steel or blue steel is sort of like worrying about whether or not a bookcase should be made out of walnut or cherry. The answer is that Frank Klaus is going to make a way better bookcase than I will. And so really what you're paying for is the skill of the blacksmith. But in general, these tools are fantastic. I bought a number of chisels off of eBay, again, just to see what was out there. And I didn't, want to buy a whole bunch of new chisels to figure this out. And I've gotten no-name chisels that no one can identify for me, because again, I don't speak Japanese or read Japanese either. That work astonishingly well, and they're part of my tool set. The other thing I also just wanted to show real quickly is I found this chisel at a flea market, and it's a Sargent chisel, and it says "Made in USA" on the top here. But the reason I bought this, I'm hoping this will show up. Oh, there, yeah. Can you see that the steel over here looks different than the steel back here? Yeah. So this is a hard piece of steel that's been forged welded to a softer piece of steel. And this is a US made chisel. It's pretty old. But the practice of taking hard pieces of steel and laminating to softer pieces of steel is actually part of the Western woodworking tradition. Because if you look at chisels and plane blades that were made up to until the late 1800s, you'll see laminations. Here, Stanley actually ran an ad once where they say our plane blades are laminated, and that's why you should buy them. And this is for the same sort of Stanley planes that we're all familiar with. I think the reason that we got away from this, though, because now we're just making all the chisels and plane blades are being made out of a single piece of steel. It's not because they're better tools, because in order to make a chisel out of a single piece of steel, there are actually some compromises that you have to make. You can't harden it as much because it'll become too brittle and will crack on you. And because of the alloying agents they put in there, it's not as easy to sharpen. So you get a chisel that's less easy to sharpen and it still won't retain an edge as long as the Japanese chisel will. So the question is, why would we do that? And the answer is Industrial Revolution. Because that's when these chisels with a single tool steel started coming out. And if you're making a chisel in a factory environment where you've got machines to basically, you got a mold and pours in there, and then you got machinery that cuts them out and shapes them and whatnot. What you're taking out of that process is the blacksmith. And the blacksmith, remember, is actually very highly skilled labor. And their ability to look at the temperature and know when to start forge welding and knowing how to hammer it and all of that, that's actually not something that you could automate in the late 1800s. And so they just got rid of it because the name of the game was to produce a chisel that was cheaper to sell. And that was one way that that was a primary way that they did it. So again, if you're thinking about differences between Japanese tools and Western tools, it actually was a time where the lamination was used in both Western and Japanese tools. It's just that in Japan, the Industrial Revolution didn't get rid of a lot of the traditional ways of making things, and that's because Japan and Asia in general, thinks that those things are valuable and those things are worth keeping around. In the West, we made a different decision.
Wilbur, that was a great presentation. It was really informative. If you read Sawmill Creek, I'm sure you've seen posts from Derek Cohen, who's another. I think he's a pediatric psychologist. Child psychologist. So.
Yeah, I actually met him. He came to New York and then let me know he was coming to New York, and we got to meet up. He's a really good guy.
Yeah, his stuff is great. I wanted to ask you about a tool I have. I don't know if you can see this. This is a tool that I picked up, I don't know, 20 years ago. It has a blade that's triangular in cross section. Has a, oh, do you have one of them too?
It's like this one, right?
Hang on, let me see if I can see you. Yes. It's not quite as, it's a little thicker in the blade than that is. It's a spear chisel, is that what it is?
Yeah, it's also referred to as a spear plane. Let me find a piece of wood. Okay, so first of all, the one that I have here is a tiny version. It's part of my carving set.
Well, this one's pretty small too.
Right. They typically come in much larger sizes. I have one. Give me like 5 seconds. I just want to see if I can find the other one I have real quick. Okay.
So I'm asking in part because this is a tool that doesn't seem to have a Western counterpart, and I've never seen anything really like this elsewhere.
I'm sorry, I can't figure out where I put it.
Okay.
But basically, and these are called spear chisels, or more commonly, they're called spear planes. And this is actually the first smoothing tool that was developed in Japan. Typically, they're longer. They're like about yay long. And so you can imagine you chop down a tree and you saw out a slab from it, and the surface is going to be rough. And so this would actually be the first step in using one of these guys. Would be the first step in smoothing out the the surface. And basically, what you would do, just make sure I'm standing in a way where you can see. Basically what you would do, the bigger one you'd typically use 2 hands like this. It's a little bit clear, but you basically put the edge down and then you tilt it up until the edge grabs, and then you can take the shaving off of the surface. Now, clearly I'm not very good at this, which is probably why my bigger one is just sitting on a shelf further away. But that's how these things would be used. So of course you would have to pay attention to grain direction. It was clearly going against the grain. But the idea is that you would walk down the board going like this, smoothing it out as you go. And it's not going to leave a completely flat surface, because you can see you'll be able to see the undulations left by the curved profile of the blade. But the people who can use this can actually get really remarkably smooth, really pretty surfaces, because it's curved. You can actually, if you're good at doing these things, you can actually leave patterns in the wood that are quite attractive to look at. And if you think about it, and when they sharpen these things, it's basically as sharp as a paring chisel. And so if you imagine like a paired surface without any tear out, because you're so good at using this thing, that's what their purpose is.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, this is laminated just like the chisels are.
Yep.
I usually use it for scraping into corners. It's really good for that. Gets into very tight angles.
Yep. Yeah, you can certainly use it for that too.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thanks, man. That was great.
Thank you again.
Yeah, so again, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to give this talk.